Okay, good. Okay, hello everyone. I am Soima Rumani, a lecturer of Poi Eungpakorn School of Development Studies, Thammasat University. And it is my great pleasure to be here with Peter Rosset from ECOSOL Advanced Studies Institute in Chiapas, Mexico, the city where the Zapatista Army of National Liberalization Uprising declared war on the Mexico government in 1994. So this is 8 a.m. Mexico time and 9 p.m. Bangkok time. Peter is a professor of agroecology. His research focuses on ecology, food sovereignty, access to land, land reform, and land grabbing and land rights of the farmers. He is also a technical advisor of the La Via Campencia, a global movement of farmers, workers, landless farmers, poor people, and rural people around the world. Peter, thanks so much for being with us today. It's my great pleasure to have you to discuss about COVID-19 and the situation of peasant movement. How do you actively promote agroecology and how agroecology contribute to sustainable development? Now I will hand over to Peter. First of all, I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, how has COVID-19 impacted the global supply chain?
Well, first of all, Ajahn Soimat, I want to say thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be with Thammasat University, one of the great universities in Southeast Asia. So thank you so much for this invitation. Yes, in terms of COVID-19 and coronavirus pandemic, there have been major impacts on the global supply chain of food. And I think the most important thing to understand is that the food that many urban people consume around the world comes from agribusiness supply chains, which are very long. So for example, if we think about meat product, pork, for example, we may have a feed crop grown in one country, maybe corn, maybe soybean, then shipped internationally to another country where the pig or the swine will be raised and then slaughtered, packaged, and sometimes even shipped to yet another country afterwards. And that's without taking into account that to raise the pigs, it's not only the feed, the grain that they eat, but also the hormones that they're given, the antibiotics that they're given, the industrial equipment used for the industrial hog or pig raising facilities. So all of this stretches the supply chain across many different countries. And what happens with a pandemic, when different countries and different regions between countries have lockdown or social distancing or many, for example, truck drivers reporting sick to work, many of the different points in the supply chain break down. Maybe the pesticide and fertilizer and seed did not arrive on time for the soybean and maize production for the pig feed, or maybe the grain, the corn grain or the soybean didn't arrive on time for the factory where the pig is being fed, or maybe there was a shutdown of global transportation and logistics between where the pigs are raised and where the supermarkets are. So there are too many sensitive points along the global supply chains. In other words, we could say that the global supply chains of the agribusiness food system have become too long, and they have too many sensitive choke points along the way where any kind of an interruption then have a multiplier effect. So for example, I was just looking at the US newspapers online from the United States during this past week, and we see many supermarket shelves in the United States, powerful central country, the supermarket shelves are empty because many of these supply chain of the different products sold in the supermarket have had breakdowns at different points along the supply chain. So to summarize, when we have a kind of a corporate industrial food system that with long supply chains and based on international trade, that is highly vulnerable to anything like a major international health crisis like we had with COVID. It's also sensitive to political pressure, to conflict between countries, to fluctuating global market prices, it's a very vulnerable food chain. And we saw that very clearly now in the case of COVID-19.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. And as you may know, in Thailand, the price of the pork has dramatically increased over the last few months. And
exactly. So this is the kind of effect that we're seeing. We have a supply chain that's very sensitive, and so and there's a secondary impact also, which is we know that these companies like to speculate with prices and they like to raise prices, but sometimes they need a justification for raising price. So I cannot speak about specifically pork in Thailand, but here I am in Mexico, where the principal food item is corn or maize for the human population. And every time there's a problem in the global supply chain, let's say global prices rise 30%, these multinational companies that control the supply, they raise the price 300%. So they justify a 300% price increase based on what's only a real 30% increase. So they use it like as a justification in order to speculate and in order to get higher profit. And this puts consumer, especially poor consumer, in very difficult situation.
Yeah. That's very bad indeed. But another way I like to ask you in reverse, how does the global food chain help to cause COVID?
Yes, I think this is very important because we've had a series of pandemics or epidemics over the last, say, 10 or 15 years in the world. We had the avian flu, we had the swine flu, now we have COVID, and we've also had outbreaks of different kind of foodborne diseases, bacterial diseases. And so like E. coli, for example, or Salmonella, for example. So we're seeing more and more epidemic or even pandemic illnesses or diseases which are coming from our food. And so it specifically is the way that the corporate industrial food system works that generates these diseases. And many of them are related to livestock, animal protein production. So if we think about how a small farmer or peasant or chow na will raise chicken or pig or cow or other animal, the animals are dispersed over an area on their farm. And so they're not in close contact with each other. But when we have industrial production of livestock, whether it's chicken, whether it's pig, they're produced under factory-like conditions where they're overcrowded. The animals are in constant contact with each other. And this causes a high rate of transmission of diseases, whether it's virus or bacteria, and also under very unsanitary conditions. And because the bacterial and virus diseases, they evolve very rapidly. When you have overcrowding conditions, which you always have in industrial corporate livestock production, it becomes like not only a factory to produce pork or to produce chicken, but it's also a factory to produce diseases. And so all of these diseases over the last 15, 20 years have come from corporate industrial livestock production. Now, if we ask specifically about COVID, we don't know for sure. Scientists are still examining the different possible causes of COVID, but I could say that there's a scientific consensus that there are three major hypotheses as to why COVID emerged. The first hypothesis is that expanding monoculture production of crop for livestock feed, probably maize production in Asia, cut down the forest to expand the maize. And this brought the wildlife, the wild animals who live in the forest, into closer and closer contact with villages where human beings live. And this meant that it's more probable that a disease jumped from wildlife, for example, bats, into the human population because there's less habitat for the wildlife. So that hypothesis would put the blame on the livestock feed industry. In other words, the monoculture production of maize or soybeans for livestock feed. The second hypothesis is that maybe the disease emerged from wet markets, for example, in Wuhan in China, where people will buy fresh meat from so-called wild animals, pangolin or other wild animals. But it turns out that most of that supposedly wild meat is not wild meat anymore. The same companies that have the factory of pigs or the factory of chicken, they now have the same factory conditions to produce the wild animals. So they're not really wild. They're produced under overcrowding with antibiotic, with hormone, just like the industrial chicken or industrial pork. And so if the disease came from the wet market, COVID, it probably came from the same industrial livestock companies that produce pork and chicken, producing now the fake wild meat. And the third hypothesis is that perhaps it escaped from a laboratory, that there was laboratory research, and then maybe the virology lab in Wuhan had some kind of a laboratory accident. So we would ask, what kind of research would take place in a laboratory that could produce a powerful virus? And it turns out that a very common kind of research before, recently banned in the United States, is gain of function research, where scientists in the laboratory, they try to breed a super virus, a very powerful virus. And the reason they try to do that is either as a biological weapon for warfare, or more likely because they want to develop a super vaccine. And so they want a super virus in the laboratory so they can develop a super vaccine. This kind of research globally is funded by two sources. One source is the Pentagon, the US military, that will produce super virus either as biological warfare or to defend against biological warfare. But more common is actually the global livestock industry, the corporate pork, chicken, beef industry. They fund this research because they know that the way that they produce animals under overcrowding conditions will always generate new diseases. So they want to get ahead of the problem and fund vaccine research. The reason is they're afraid that governments will ban this overcrowded kind of factory farming of animals. And so they want to be able to say to governments, don't worry, we already will have the vaccines, so it doesn't matter if this kind of production produces disease. So under the Obama administration, the United States banned this kind of research, which is funded by something called the EcoHealth Alliance, which gets funding from the livestock industry. And where they moved the research was to the Wuhan laboratory in China. So this is the least likely hypothesis, but even if it was a lab escape, it was probably from research funded by the same industry that does the monoculture of maize and the same industry that does the overcrowded production of animals. In other words, this global corporate supply chain of industrial food production, particularly livestock, is implicated in all three scientific hypotheses about the origin of COVID. So not only did COVID cause the collapse of the supply chains, but the supply chains probably caused COVID as well. So we have to ask the question from the point of view of human health. Do we want to continue to have our animal protein produced in a way that also produces diseases and pandemics?
That's very huge concern. Actually, I think I read some paper, but I could not remember how to explain. They said that human will face a new disease because of global warming, because the ice from the North and South Pole are melting, and there are a lot of bacteria under the earth melt with those ice. And then there are those bacteria that generate a new disease for us.
Well,
and
also,
we have
yes.
to prepare.
Definitely global warming makes the problem worse, not only because of melting of ice, but also because with higher temperature, bacteria and virus multiply more quickly. So
Yes.
this means that if we're in general conditions from global warming that create higher risk, then it makes it more important that we consider how our food system is organized, because we don't want to have a bad interaction between industrial livestock production that causes diseases and higher temperature that makes the diseases multiply more quickly. This is to create the worst case scenario, and that seems to be what we're heading toward.
Yeah,
and it's also worth mentioning that the same global supply chains are the main cause of global warming, because from between 30 and 60% of all global greenhouse gas emissions comes from the corporate global food chain, which emits greenhouse gas at all points along the supply chain. So it's yet another reason to reconsider how we're producing our food.
That's the supply chain side and food production side. I like to ask you another angle of this. I also came across that land price in some area going up along with COVID-19 because many urban workers are moving back to the rural and they struggle for land. Could you please expand more? What are the impacts of COVID-19 on peasants, rural workers, and other marginalized groups?
Yes, it's very interesting, and we can see both positive and negative impact. For example, most of the people around the world who live in urban slum, they come from peasant Chao Na family in village, and because of many economic policy that hurt the economic livelihood of rural people, they are economic migrants to the city. And many of them lost their jobs, not just in Thailand, but around the world during COVID, because many lockdown and economic crisis and things like that. And many of them have to move back to the village. We see the same thing in Mexico, we see in Thailand. Very interesting study being carried out by researchers at Chulalongkorn University at Kusri, the Social Research Institute. They found that during COVID, the population of the average rural village in Thailand increased 30% because of family member who moved back. And so at first, this caused problem in the village because maybe too many mouths to feed, not enough economic opportunity. Maybe they want to buy land, no land, something like that. But also over a short period of time, people start to plant more crop also. In other words, use the migrant who return as labor in the family agriculture activity. And so we see that having rural village is actually important or functional to a national economy, because when there's a labor demand in industry or city, then the village offer labor to the urban industry. And when there's economic crisis and there's not enough employment in the rural area, then the rural village can absorb the extra labor and actually turn it into productive labor through planting larger area for food production. So we can see that in a sense, one of the positive aspects of still having rural people in our modern society and rural village is it functions like to cushion different kind of shock from the national economy. So this is one kind of impact. Now, another problem that we see with governments around the world is that governments are mostly focused, for example, from a health point of view, and also from economic emergency measure point of view, focused on urban population, and even sometimes focused on middle class or upper middle class population. So what we saw when COVID arrived to most countries, it arrived first to upper middle class neighborhoods in cities because come from international travelers. And who is traveling are upper middle class people, more or less. And so when those are people with a lot of political power. So when those people start to get sick, governments put all kinds of health measure, they put lockdown, they put social distancing, they put curfew, they put many kind of measure like that. And they managed to control in the first wave, they control COVID for upper middle class people, but then it go from the upper middle class neighborhood to the poor neighborhood, to the urban slum. Many people start to get sick in urban slum, but at the same time that governments start to relax the public health measure because now middle class people, they're okay and government not care so much about poor people. So, but even so, even when in urban slum, they still do some measures. But after urban slum, the third place where the last place where the first wave of COVID got to then was the peasant village, rural village. And then governments don't care at all anymore. There's no news coverage. They think only poor people, only people with no political power, and not even most government, not even keeping good record, not offering COVID testing in rural village, not have health clinic, not have intensive care hospital unit. And so right now around the world, we see COVID causing a lot of damage in rural villages around the world because the very sad reality is most government don't care about poor people in rural area. On the other hand, we've seen the poor people and the organization at the village level and at peasant organization, Chao Na organization, indigenous and traditional people organization, because government don't care about them during COVID, many times now they do their own public health measures. They create their own curfew, their own lockdown, their own social distance, and they go back to traditional medicine because many of the symptoms of COVID actually can be treated very well by traditional medicine, traditional herb. And so they rediscover a lot of that. And also because of the supply chain breakdown, they're not getting the, many Chao Na or peasant, they had stopped to produce their own food and they buy food. But now with COVID, food not arrive anymore to village store, and many, they start to plant all their own food again, which we could say is a positive outcome because it makes them less vulnerable to different kind of economic problem at the national level. So their complex impact, we see that most government don't care about rural people, but we also see that rural people, when they organize at village level or at farmer association level, they can have a lot of self-power. So that's a positive thing. So it's a complex situation, as I say, with both positive and negative things that we've seen.
This is similar to to the rural area in Thailand, that they, do you know, some kind of medicine, some kind of herbs that very popular here, and during
yes,
COVID,
I saw that Thailand approved some traditional herb for COVID treatment, and this happened in some other countries as well. Because in terms of managing COVID illness, the most important thing is to control the symptom, that they don't get out of control. And many herb and traditional medicine are very good for all of the different kind of symptom that COVID cause.
Okay, so I have another question, but this is kind of like more related to politics. Like in many countries, some governments have downplayed the health impacts of COVID-19, but used COVID for political purposes, including my own country, Thailand. So has it happened in your region? You may have some example from Mexico or from Brazil.
Yes, well, I cannot speak about Thailand, but I can certainly speak about Latin America. And as you say, there's a major contradiction expressed at the level of governments all across Latin America. On the one hand, as you say, they want to minimize the importance of COVID because they want to justify that people need to go to work to support industry, to support national economy. But on the other hand, when there's situation of widespread political protest, then all of a sudden they're concerned about COVID and they want to ban any kind of agglomeration or group of people on the street. We saw this particularly before the first wave of COVID at the end of 2019 and beginning of 2020. We had a wave of social protest against neoliberal government all over Latin America. And the biggest protests were in Chile, in Colombia, in Ecuador, and it seemed like they were about to maybe have forced governments to resign in various countries. And then COVID saved the governments because the government said, oh, COVID, now we have to say no protest. And then first wave, no protest, second wave, no protest, third wave, no protest. And so now almost 2 years pass and they not allow any protest, and this gives chance for some governments to be safe. On the other hand, the country that had the biggest protest before COVID was Chile, and they stopped the protest, but then they could not stop the election, and the government had overwhelming electoral loss, and new president elected who came precisely from the student movement. And so they could not control completely. As soon as they allow free election, then they lose. But yes, as you suggest, many governments, they use COVID for political purpose, and on the economic side, they try to minimize COVID. So it's like a contradiction in the way governments use COVID.
What you say is just like, I feel like you talk about Thailand as well. Okay. My last question, just the last one. I will talk about your professional and your book about agroecology. I'd like to ask you, one of your arguments challenge the industrialized food system is agroecology can give superior production. It also produce less greenhouse gas emission. Besides your academic work, you also an activist working with the poor farmer around the world to fight for their land rights and food sovereignty, right? So I would like to ask you, during COVID-19, in what way peasant movements and agroecology can address the issue of food system and sustainable development?
Yeah, so I guess we can go back to my answer to one of the first questions was how COVID reveal some of the problems or weaknesses of the corporate food system. So on the one hand, the corporate food system with a long supply chain collapsed in many countries during the health crisis, and so was unable to feed people. And many people, they went back to local markets and peasant market because peasant production continued or even increased during COVID when corporate production many times go into collapse. And then we also saw how the industrial form of food production causes new diseases, whether bacterial diseases or virus or swine flu, bird flu, COVID. And if we produce food in a more local way and a more ecological way, for example, if we're not using hormone and antibiotic on the animal, we're not using pesticide and chemical fertilizer on the crop, then food is much more healthy, and the conditions of food production are not generating new diseases. And so we have been saying for a long time, some of us scientists who work on agricultural ecology or agroecology as we call it, and also peasant Chauna and traditional people movement, saying that a combination of traditional farming practice from before chemicals used in agriculture together with some modern agroecology practice can produce food in a more local way, in a way that doesn't generate greenhouse gas emission, that doesn't create new diseases or new pandemics, and that produces much more healthy food. And so the basis of that would be recognizing the land rights of peasants, changing from the industrial model to the agroecology model, and changing from the global supply chain to the local food market model could address many of the problems that we're facing as humanity at a planetary level today. But then often, as you suggest, many people will say, well, can enough food be produced if we go to that kind of a local and small farmer model? And we show in our book, and many other scientific studies also show that we summarize in our book, that in fact, on a per rai or per hectare, the peasant production, which is much more diverse, actually produce more food per unit area than the corporate monoculture. So it's actually a myth or a lie that the corporate system is more productive. If we need more food, we're also better with a more localized, more peasant food system, which we call food sovereignty in La Via Campesina, the global peasant farmer movement. That's their logo hanging behind me. And to be based on agroecology, on land rights, on land reform. But it's a political struggle, and that's why La Via Campesina, as the small farmer and peasant and traditional people movement in 80 countries around the world, is struggling not only for land rights and better life for rural people, but also for better food system for everybody and better environment for everybody. And this includes the various organizations in Thailand who are part of La Via Campesina, and many who are not member of La Via Campesina, but who are allies and also have the same position in favor of local food system, agroecology, organic food, local market. And I really believe, both scientifically and also as an activist, that this is the direction that we as humanity have to move in the post-COVID time. If we don't want more pandemic, if we want to address global warming, if we want to address the health impacts of unhealthy corporate food, then we really need to talk about going to a more localized, more small farmer and more ecological food system. Yeah,
I do agree. So I think it's time. And thank you so much, Professor Peter Rosset, for taking time with us in this interview. So thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to seeing you soon in Thailand.
Thank you, Ajahn Soimat. And I also would say that I believe Chiang Mai University will publish very soon our book in Phasa Thai and Thai language. So maybe sometime in the next few months, the book will become available. In English, the title is Agroecology, Science and Politics. I'm not sure what the Thai title will be, but I hope that our Thai public will be able to read the book soon in the Thai language. So thank you so much for this invitation.
Okay, thank you so much and see you again soon.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
ขอบคุณครับ
ขอบคุณค่ะ